So today, we're digging into a question that sounds pretty simple on the surface, but trust me, it is anything but. How do you actually grade someone's understanding of Shakespeare?
All right, picture this. You're sitting down for your final exam. You open up the test booklet, and that's the very first question you see. What is a man? Discuss. That's it. No context, no other clues. I mean, where would you even begin to answer that?
Believe it or not, this was a completely real question on an advanced level exam about King Lear. And it just perfectly sums up the weird, fascinating challenge of trying to test literature. It really makes you wonder, how in the world did we get from just, checking if someone read a book to asking them to solve the fundamental mysteries of the human condition? Okay, let's break this down. First, we're going to look at the surprising origins of literature tests. Then we'll dive into some of the absolute strangest questions ever asked. After that, we'll explore the big shift toward grading personal response. And finally, we'll get to the big one. What even is the right answer to a literary question?
So let's start with this idea of exams for an empire. Now, you might think the literature test was invented in some quiet, dusty university library, right? Well, the truth is, its origins are actually in the engine room of global power. So, back in the 19th century, the British Empire had a problem. It needed a standardized way to pick administrators to go run its colonies. The solution they came up with? The Indian civil service exams. And literature was one of the subjects. This whole model worked so well that it got adopted back home by big universities like Oxford and Cambridge, and an entire exam industry was born.
And here's the crucial point. These tests were never, ever designed to measure your deep, soul-stirring connection to a poem. Nope, they were a bureaucratic tool. They were just designed to check your knowledge of specific, testable facts. It was all about memory, not about meaning. So what did that actually look like in practice? Let's take a little trip back in time, into a 19th century exam hall, and check out the kinds of questions students were facing.
Get a load of this. This is a real question from an early Indian civil service exam. It literally asks students to find and correct the grammar in a line from Shakespeare. I mean, think about that for a second. They were treating the bard's language, which existed before modern grammar rules were even a thing, like it was a faulty piece of computer code that needed to be debugged. Just wild.
And it didn't stop there. Here are some more examples from the 1870s. Identify the author and give a brief description of the White Doe of Rylestone, or give some account of the fourth period of Shakespeare's career. It's basically a trivia game.
So, yeah, the focus was entirely on things you could just memorize. Who wrote what happened in Chapter 3, explaining weird old words, paraphrasing passages, and, like we saw, analyzing grammar. Your personal feelings about the book? Totally, 100% irrelevant.
But then, something started to change. Educators began to wonder, hey, is just memorizing a bunch of facts really the point of reading literature? And this led to a massive shift, a shift toward what we call response, a move from testing what you know to testing what you think.
You can break this down pretty simply. The old way was all about memory, facts, grammar, recall. The new method, that was all about response. It focused on a student's comprehension and, this is the really important part, their own individual interpretation.
This quote from an assessment board just captures the new philosophy perfectly. The goal wasn't just to make sure you'd done the reading anymore. The goal was to actually measure your growth as a reader.
But of course, this opened up a brand new, massive can of worms. If every student's response is personal and subjective, well, how can a grader possibly give it an objective score? How do you slap a number grade on someone's opinion? And that brings us right to the central paradox of any modern literature exam. We're trying to test an untestable feeling. We're somehow in the business of trying to grade pleasure itself.
Let's be really clear about what we're talking about here. Reading for pleasure is defined as an enjoyable, intense, private activity where you can become totally absorbed. You know that feeling, right? It's a deeply personal experience. So how on earth do you turn that into a test score?
Well, as the scholar Charles Alderson writes, the very act of trying to assess this experience risks creating a self-consciousness which destroys the very nature of the event. In other words, just knowing you're going to be tested on how much you enjoyed a book can completely kill the enjoyment. He basically concludes that trying to assess this kind of reading might be incredibly hard and maybe, just maybe, a really bad idea.
And this leads us to the final and probably the most profound question of all. In a modern literature exam, what even is the right answer?
Alderson just frames this dilemma perfectly.
When we ask a student for an interpretation, whose are we looking for? Should it be what the author intended, or the reader's own personal takeaway? What about the official version from a famous literary critic? Or is it the one the teacher taught in class? Who gets to be the authority here?
So you have this fundamental conflict. On one side, you've got the reader's personal take. It's unique, it's theirs. But on the other side, you have the accepted critical reading, the standardized theory-based interpretation that you can actually teach and test in a classroom.
And that brings us right back to where we started. This conflict is exactly why a question like, "What is a man?" even exists on a test. It's this high-stakes attempt to bridge that huge gap, to ask for a deeply personal, philosophical response, but inside the structured, gradable world of a Shakespeare play. So let's recap the whole journey. Literature exams didn't start as some celebration of art. They were a bureaucratic tool for an empire. Over time, they changed from simple memory tests into these complex assessments of personal interpretation. But that created this deep paradox of how you grade a subjective feeling, which leads to the debate we're still having today about whose interpretation is the right one.
And it leaves us with one final, pretty challenging thought. If a student, a teacher, and a literary critic can all have different but equally valid interpretations of the exact same text, then what are we really testing when we put a grade on that paper?